I want to share one of the stories that I write about in the book, and this happens to do with a border patrol agent, and a border patrol agent who ends up saying that the border itself is absurd. Let me tell you how you arrived to that point. So the border patrol agent, his name Brendan Lenihan. He's no longer an agent; he's a former agent, and he shared with me the story. The story began while he was patrolling around the town of Arivaca. That's about 10 miles from the U.S. Mexico border. And he gets a call from the radio dispatch. And the dispatcher says, a motion sensor has been tripped, and it was good up a mountain range. So motion sensors, that's another one of the technological, they're implanted underground. There's about 12,000 of them in the U.S. Mexico borderlands. Now these motion sensors are actually equipped with cameras as well. But when Lenihan's story was before that, it was about 10 years ago. So he dirt road, up to the top of the mountain. There was a mine shaft. And lo and behold, there were a bunch of footprints up there. So he, like a border patrol agent, got out of his vehicle and began to plan to follow the footprints. While he was doing that, a man appeared out of a ravine in front of him, waving his hands in distress. The way he described it, kind of like Juan Carlos when I was on that road. And it stopped him in his tracks. Normally, he told me the way he conveys the story, normally he would have asked him for his papers. And if he didn't have the correct papers, he would have arrested him. But for some reason, he told me in that moment, he didn't do that. There was something about it. And so the man told him, he was speaking in rapid Spanish. Now, border patrol agents are supposed to know Spanish, but a lot of times they don't. So he's having trouble understanding him. But he figured out that there was a family member of his was in distress. So he ends up following the man down in a ravine, which is another thing that's uncommon for a border patrol agent to do. He did sling his assault rifle around. He brought his assault rifle with him. So he got down to the bottom of the ravine, and it turns out that the man's brother, who was younger brother, was at the bottom of the ravine, and he was laying back and the man's cousin was kind of rocking his head back and forth. And when the younger brother opened his eyes, he only could see the whites of his eyes. And obviously he was in pretty serious distress. And so what Lenihan did was he called dispatch and said that they needed a helicopter. The helicopter couldn't get down into the ravine. And so they had to bring the younger brother out of the ravine. And so how they did that was that the Lenihan clenched, well, I guess he brought his arms together with the older brother to create like a stretcher. So they held each other's arms at their elbows. And the younger brother laid on top. At this point, the way he describes the story, the younger brother, there was some bile coming out of the younger brother's mouth, and he started vomiting. So the signs of distress were pretty evident. And again, this is something that how the border is designed, right? This is what happens almost on a daily basis. And so they started to, with the cousin holding his head, they started to bring him up the side of the ravine. And in that moment, it was hot. It was like September. September is pretty hot in the desert still. And so they started, he was sweating, and he started to lose grip. And he lost grip, and he lost grip, and he lost grip until, as he describes it, he was holding hands with the older brother. That act of holding hands, according to Lenihan's rendition, again, he said that it became strangely intimate. The moment became strangely intimate. And then he lost sense of who he was. He looked down at the younger brother and he forgot he was a border patrol agent, and he thought the younger brother was actually his younger brother. And this happened for a long, long moment until his radio crackled. And then he was brought back into the fact that he was a border patrol agent. And even though he doesn't admit it, like forthrightly, I'm pretty convinced that that moment was what made him leave the force. But he ended up long story short, and I read more about it in the book. He gets to the top and realizes that the younger brother probably died in his arms, in their arms as they went up the ravine. The medical team arrived, and then later that night, and now he was in a sense of distress, I guess, and he went to a bar with other border patrol agents, and they were trying to make Lenihan feel better, and the way he conveyed it, they said, "Don't worry, this is part of the border game." The border game. In other words, most all border patrol agents have dealt with that, because that's how it's designed to be. That's how the border is designed to be. But he couldn't shake it off. And the next day he talked to his supervisor. His supervisor called him knowing that he wasn't happy about the whole situation. And the supervisor said, "Don't worry, it turns out they were drug smokers." So then Lenihan said, this is the way, actually when he said that in the interview, then he looked at me and said, what did I care? What did I care that they were drug smokers? I want to read a little bit of it. I can directly quote him. It said to me, he said to me, "It doesn't make a difference. They just seem like regular guys, and who knows what kind of job I would have had if I grew up in their situation. It could have been me." And then he said, somebody died trying to sneak drugs into our country. And I went out there and had this strange and traumatic experience trying to both stop and help them. And now my neighbor, so part of the story is that later that evening, his neighbor, he smelled marijuana. At that point, now in Arizona, marijuana is actually illegal, but at that point it wasn't. And he smelled a waft of marijuana going through his open window. And he says, now my neighbor is smoking the very thing I'm trying to stop. And then he said, there is an element of